Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel where today we are doing my 2020 in review, my best and worst lists. Basically, this video is all the highlights of my reading from 2020. And let's just jump right in with some stats. And first and foremost, I read 127 books this last year, according to Goodreads. And actually going through them and really looking at them, it was interesting just how many like short stories and novellas and a couple graphic novels and like some middle grade stuff that I read, which was really evident when I looked at like the average page count for each thing that was counted, and that was 302 pages. So even though I read some longer stuff like Leviathan Wakes and some other long books, um, I read enough short stuff that it didn't make much of a dent. And honestly, that really worked for me for 2020. My attention span was a little bit shot with this last dumpster fire of a year. And so having those shorter stories was actually really nice, and it really just worked for me. Now, the number I was a little bit surprised about was how many books I DNF'd, and the official number is 41. So I mentioned DNFing 41 books on this channel. Now, the thing is, there were a few books that I did DNF that I didn't mention, mostly because I only got like 4 or 5 pages in. I didn't even mention that I was going to be reading it. So I was like, nah, I won't say anything, especially when it was only like 4 or 5 pages, or, less, if it's like less than 20, right? And I didn't even mention I was going to read it. I just then didn't mention it. So overall, I probably did DNF like 45 to 50 books, which averages out to like 4 a month, which is a lot. That's a lot of DNFing. But the thing is, like, I did have my primary big goal to read down my physical TBR shelf. And part of the reason that that was such a big goal is because I had a lot of books that had been sitting on my shelf for years, to the point where like they're no long I my tastes had changed. And so I kept them on the shelf because I knew that they probably weren't going to be for me, but I wanted to still give them a chance. And then I gave them a chance and they weren't for me. So I ended up DNFing them. So even though that's a really high number of DNFs, I'm actually really, really comfortable with it. And it should not be nearly so high in 2021. We can hope. So moving into series, I did complete out 6 series this year. Now that's not a ton, but it's more than I was expecting, because I was mostly focusing on my physical TBR. So this is just something that I was kind of trying to do on the side, was to read my series. So I'm actually really happy with that. But the big number is the number of series I DNF'd, and that is 8. And basically what I did is I sat down with my list of series that I'm in the middle of, and I really looked at them. And if I was a couple books into the series, like especially like 3 or 4, and I wasn't loving it, I pretty much just DNF'd it, because like there are so many books that I'm so excited for. I don't need to put in so much time and effort to reading a series that I'm not loving. So yeah, I DNF'd it. I'm really happy with that. And now I have less series that I'm in the middle of. And then the last little tidbit, because I found it interesting, it may come as no surprise to you, but my most read author this year was Seanan McGuire, because I love Seanan McGuire. And so between the books that I read that were under Seanan McGuire's own name, as well as her pen name, Mira Grant, I read 24 things, which is a lot. Part of that because I did a big reread of the October Days series, and that's like 14 books. And so there was just a lot of Seanan McGuire this year. You guys, I know, I'm aware. I regret nothing, to be perfectly honest, because I love Seanan McGuire's works so much. So there you go. So next, let's go ahead and jump into my lists, the best, worst, disappointing, and a couple of others. But I did try to limit myself to only mentioning 3 books in each category. And then the other thing you should note is like it's not ranked in any way. It's just kind of, honestly, it's mostly chronological as I went through my wrap ups to like note which books I loved and which ones I hated. But yeah, they're not like ranked or anything. So first, let's talk about the best books of the year. And so I only have 2 books in this category because I separated out this series. There were a lot of books that I loved that were in series that I was loving. So I'll talk about that in a minute. But the ones that I loved that were not part of series that I was reading this year, the first one is This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal Al-Mohar and Max Gladstone. And you guys, this is science fiction, adult science fiction, queer romance with super flowery writing that I actually was okay with, an interesting chapter structure, and it was just awesome. I really, really enjoyed it. And actually, when I went to watch my January wrap up, like I was so clearly very happy to be talking about that book. And that's just kind of awesome and honestly makes me want to reread it. So I'll have to like move it up the list of rereads. But the next one is the other book that is in the best list is Slay by Brittany Morris. And I really, really like this book. I had a few quibbles, but honestly, mostly it's just really good. And this is a young adult contemporary novel about being Black in America, being Black in a predominantly white community who is pretty ignorant of racism and just generally what Black people face. And so the thing that I love the most about this book, there's a lot of things that I really liked, but the thing that I love like the most about this book is that Brittany Morris showcased like multiple opinions about various topics, like from Black characters. So basically the author had 3 different main Black characters, and they all had different opinions on the same topics of like things that affect the Black community. And it was really cool to see that because it gave the book a level of nuance that like a lot of other books are generally just missing. And so I think it was really a great way to have a conversation within the book that still invited the reader into that conversation and kept it at a level that like a lot of different people like myself could understand. And I just really, really enjoyed it. So next, let's talk about the best series. And you guys, I could not narrow it down to 3, so we're going to talk about 4 because why not? So first and foremost, we have the Murderbot Diaries, and this is by Martha Wells. It is a adult science fiction, and it's following Murderbot, and Murderbot is great. It's action, and it's so good, and we get to watch Murderbot, like, you know, try to plan on the fly, and like I love Murderbot's interactions with like humans and other AI, and I just love those books. So I had so much fun rereading it. The next series I want to mention is the Firebird trilogy by Claudia Gray, and this is a young adult science fiction with like dimensional travel. And the 2 things that really stood out to me about this is how, first off, this is a series that asks the big ethical questions, and that's actually a large part of the conversation in these books. And yeah, it's a little clunky because it's like YA, but I liked the questions that we were asking. I like how it got integrated into the plot, and I just generally enjoyed that part of it. The other thing that I really liked is that we actually got to see a main character rely on their support network. So what I mean is the main character is 18 and is so very 18 sometimes. And when she does something kind of silly or stupid, she like at one point she remembers like some advice that her sister gave her, and she literally changed actions. Or like at one point one of her friends sat her down and basically gave her a verbal smack upside the head and told her to quit being a hypocrite. And like, I love that so much because I feel like we, especially in YA, we don't generally get that. We get the main character like figuring it out because their mistake creates a lot of problems. They don't have intervention from like their friends. And so I really, really appreciated seeing it in this trilogy. Next up, we have the October Day series because I did do a gigantic reread of this. It is one of my favorite series. And honestly, doing the reread, by the way, Seanan McGuire, in case you didn't remember, it's by Seanan McGuire. But the reason why I love doing this reread is because it reminded me why I love this series so much. And it's because it's got this world building that is just off the hook. It like fairy is part of like our modern day, and it's just humans can't see it or interact with it. And just how Seanan McGuire wrote it feels like it really could be there. And every single book, we're getting more history, we're getting more background, we're getting more world building, and it all fits together so neatly. It's beautiful to behold. And honestly, the storytelling itself is fairly like layered, and there's always stuff going on beneath the surface. And like, I so love that we get like unobtrusive clues in like the first couple of books about reveals that don't happen until like book 12 or 13. So it's like a little Easter egg if you go back and reread it. And it's so good. It's so good. I love it so much. And then the last series that I want to talk about is the Kate Daniels series from Ilona Andrews. Now, this is another adult urban fantasy series that has really great world building. It is just like, you just know that it is so vast and we are only seeing a small slice of it. And I just really appreciate it. And I ended up really adoring the main character of Kate Daniels. I really loved watching her interact with all the different characters. I didn't love all the other characters necessarily, but watching them interact was so good and made me so happy. This was actually the series where when I picked up a book, I had to remind myself that 4 a.m. is not an okay bedtime. That I actually need to stop reading. So I really enjoyed them. So now let's move on to our worst books of the year. And let's talk about Daredevil, Dr. Husband by Allison Roberts. And this I read at the very beginning of the year. It's a Harlequin romance, I think. I'm going to insert a cover if I can find one. I haven't always been able to find one though. But there were so many problems with this, from like prevalent themes, like for example, you should always forgive your family no matter what because they're your family. And I was like, no, like that's not okay. But like stuff like that, and like the romance was just terrible. Is where it made it so I really didn't like it. But what tipped me over into hate is that there is a character that is mentally ill, and she is portrayed as being inherently untrustworthy because she's mentally ill. Like literally, she was lying, but everybody around her was like, "Why would you ever have trusted her in the first place, though? She's mentally ill." And I'm like, "No, I'm done. That's a terrible take, and this book can burn for all I care. And it is out of my house, and I am happy that I no longer have to think about it." Next up is Bump and Run by Edward Taft, and this is described by the author as an erotic golf thriller. And I'm here to tell you that is not an accurate description. So I guess technically it is erotic in that there is a lot of sex, but the sex is really bland and it's pretty terribly written. And the thriller part, I mean, like I can see the storyline he was trying to make into a thriller, but it didn't really work. So it's really not a thriller. And yeah, there's actually golf. There's really technical golf scenes and everything, which actually makes it completely out of place for this novel. It was very strange. So like, I don't know. please don't read this book. Because here's the deal. If you want erotica, you're going to get better erotica from basically anywhere else. If you want a thriller, please don't read this book, because this is not a thriller. It's not a good thriller. And if you want a golf book, you should not have to wade through terrible sex scenes and this weird non-thriller plot just to get golf. Please don't read this book. It's bad. I do have a reading vlog where I actually reacted to reading it. If you're interested, I'll leave it linked down below. And then lastly, in my worst category is actually The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson. Now, this is not a terrible book, but it definitely was a mismatch for what I like from a book. So basically all the stuff that I need from a book was not done well in The Final Empire. And the things that Brandon Sanderson did really well were things that either I didn't care about, honestly, or were choices that I did not appreciate. So, for example, pacing. Brandon Sanderson just generally does really slow openings, and the middle starts to pick up, and the end is really, really fast, like whiplash. And that's just generally what he does. And that's a choice, and it's not necessarily good or bad, but I don't like it. So even though he did it pretty well, I don't like it. So I ended up rating this 3 stars on Goodreads, but honestly my enjoyment was no more than a 2 star. And so I just don't have any intention of continuing on with this series. So next category we're going to talk about is my most disappointing reads. So not the ones that I dislike the most, because we just talked about those, but the ones that I had high hopes for and they just crashed and burned. So first up is Steampunk Homes, Legacy of the Nautilus by PC Cast. So this is a book that I had really high hopes for. It's a steampunk homes. I mean, what's not to love, right? And it had been on my TBR for my wishlist TBR for kind of a really long time, but it was hard to find and get a hold of because it was published through a Kickstarter. And so, but in 2019, my spouse found a copy and bought it for me for Christmas. And so when I got to January, it's 2020, I was like, I am going to read this. And it was literally the first thing I read, and it was terrible. There was nothing redeemable about it. It wasn't bad. I didn't hate it, but it just was so mediocre at everything. And so I was very disappointed. And of course, it was the first thing I read in 2020. And it was a harbinger of things to come. So that was very, very unfortunate. The next thing I want to talk about is Rivals in the City by Y.S. Lee. And this is the 4th book in the Agency series. And this series actually has a really interesting premise where we are following a main character who is female in Victorian times. And she's a spy because women are overlooked and underestimated. And I'm like, rock on, sign me up. And the first 3 books were actually really good. There were definitely issues, but they were still really enjoyable books. And then I got to this 4th one, Rivals in the City. And everything, literally everything took a nosedive. And it just wasn't good. It was just not up to the standards of what I was used to from this series. And of course, it's the last book in this series, so there's nothing to kind of help prop it up at the end. It's if you're going to stumble on a book in the series, if an author is going to stumble, you don't want it to be the last one. Because now, of course, I'm sitting here going, I don't know that I ever want to reread this. So, yeah. And then lastly is Shadow Study by Maria V. Snyder. And this is the 4th book in a series. It's the 1st book in the 2nd trilogy of this series, the study series. And I was really excited for this because I loved the 1st trilogy. It followed our main character of Yelena. I really liked Yelena, especially there were a couple things about her that were just very different than a lot of the female main characters we get. And so I was so stoked to read this 2nd trilogy. And then I read the 1st book and it was so bad. And it was it was some of the worst writing I've ever seen from Maria V. Snyder. There were certain specific scenes that were the worst writing. And 3 different rotating perspectives that were just completely unnecessary. And then the things that I loved about Yelena, I mean, the writing was on the wall at the end of that first book that was going to change. And then I read the last 20 pages of the third book in that trilogy, the second trilogy. And yeah, it completely, like, not even just she's no longer that person. She's like the direct opposite of that person. And I was like, I hate this so much. Yeah. So I did not continue on the series. And I'm just going to pretend it never happened. So let's move into the next category. And that is books that I had such mixed feelings about that it was really hard to talk about them. So first up is Renegade by J.A. Souders. And this is a really interesting YA, I think science fiction. And our main character lives in basically like a bubble, like a city under the sea in like a dome, like kind of like Atlantis. But she ends up wanting to try to escape up to the surface. And I just thought it was really well done. Like the escape itself was really interesting and it was like very action heavy. And we got to watch the antagonist like descent into madness. And that's not generally a trope that I love, but I really liked it in this book. I thought it was well done. And like our main character's memories are being messed with, and how J.A. Souders wrote that was really interesting and I really appreciated it. And if that's all this book was, I would have rated it 4 or 4.5 stars. But there was a romantic storyline, and it was everything you hate about a YA romance. Everything. To the point where at the end there was this thing that our main character had to do that was like a willpower thing. And it was literally, I can do it because the person that I love is counting on me to do it, and I can do it for him. It's like, oh my gosh, why? And so I got very upset because like that was such other than that romantic stuff going on, it was such a good book. So it was so hard to figure out an end rating for it. Next up is Miles Morales Spider-Man by Jason Reynolds. And this was such an interesting book because everything surrounding Miles Morales was done really well. Miles Morales is an Afro-Latino kid from a poor family who happens to get a scholarship to a bougie school. So he's like trying to stay on the straight and narrow so that he can stay in that school so that he has a chance of getting out of poverty, right? Like, and I absolutely adored watching him try to balance all the stuff that he needs as Miles Morales and the stuff that he knows he needs to do as Spider-Man because it's his moral obligation, right? Watching him with that struggle was awesome, and I really appreciated it. But everything where it was like a straight Spider-Man storyline just wasn't done well. And it's like, as a comic book fan, there are certain things that I really want from my superhero storylines. For example, if you're going to do an origin story, do it right. Either do it right or don't talk about it at all, but don't half-ass it. If you half-ass it, I'm gonna be mad. And so I was mad at this book because our origin story was like just not good. It's like, man, why did you even mention it? And it was just stuff like that where it was like, I wonder, I don't know who the intended audience for this book is, because if it's comic book fans, like, man, like I don't know a ton of people that would be really happy with this Spider-Man storyline. And so it was really strange because like I want to recommend this book so strongly just for the Miles Morales storyline, but like I have to like warn that like that Spider-Man crap is just like kind of awful, which sucks. And then the last book in this category is Grim Space by Anna Geary. And you guys, it's a dumpster fire. Grim Space is so bad. Like I could give you a laundry list of all the things that are wrong with this book, and I loved it so much. Like I enjoyed it 4 stars. even as I was reading it, I was like, I'm enjoying this, but also I can see all the different things that are so stupidly wrong with this book. And like, I mean, I just loved it in spite of itself. And I read the entire series. I mean, no accounting for taste, right? I don't care. Like, I read it and enjoyed it, but like, how do you talk about it? I don't know. So there you go. And then this last little category are just things that I wanted to mention, like a special mention. So first and foremost, I wanted to mention Kingdom of Needle and Bone by Mira Grant, which is a horror novella. And so I love this one because it really helped me realize I do like horror, especially the biomedical horror that Mira Grant writes, because she researches everything. So everything is scientifically possible, not probable. Like too many things would have to line up just right, but it is possible, and that's freaking terrifying, right? So it's like Kingdom of Needle and Bone. I sat down and I devoured it because I was like, oh, I'm enjoying this. This is so good. I love this. And I wasn't scared at all. And then I went and laid down in bed and I couldn't sleep because I was like, oh God, this could really happen. It's and like to be fair, I should warn that this book is about a mutated measles pandemic, so be careful. The next special mention is actually to The Tea Master and the Detective by Aliette de Bodard. And like you guys, I had very mixed feelings about this. This novella is like a Sherlock Holmes of science fiction Sherlock Holmes in space with Vietnamese culture, I think is how I've described it. And like I had really mixed feelings. I liked the overall story, but there was a lot of details that I was missing, that kind of thing. But I keep thinking about that world. It's the kind of thing where like my mind will wander occasionally and I just end up back in the world of that book. And so like I mean, props to the author for creating this really interesting world that just kind of sucked me in. And then next special mention is to the book, a nonfiction book, and that is Divergent Mind by Janara Nuremberg. And like this, I actually was disappointed after reading it a little bit because this is a book that is about neurodivergencies in females and how it is different than males. So females present very differently than males. This is not particularly common knowledge at this point. We are starting to get it, but like truly the scientific community is trying to figure out what it all means. Like they've got a lot of work to do, right? And this, I kind of wanted an intermediate book, and this is not an intermediate book. It's a beginner book. But and since having read this, what I'm finding is that I actually really appreciate that this is out in the world because it is really accessible. It gives more concrete examples of like how people like women with neurodivergencies may think in different situations, which is extremely helpful for women to recognize themselves as they read this book. And honestly, I'm just really happy to have this out in the world. And then the last thing I wanted to mention was actually Leviathan Wakes by James S.A. Corey. And it's not because of the book itself, it's actually because I did a review of this. And in the review, I mentioned that there were a lot of technical scientific terms dropped into the text without a whole lot of explanation. And I said, like, I don't know if the science is accurate because I don't have enough of a science background to like know what they're talking about, right? And like shout out to the community because that review attracted so many people that were so happy to help me understand the science. I had so many comments from people just being like, "Oh no, this is an asteroid and this is what's happening." Like even one awesome commenter who like wrote me an essay, and in that essay basically answered every single science question I could have possibly had in Leviathan Wakes. And honestly, it was so helpful. Like it literally did answer all my questions. And I feel like I have enough of a basis now that I can much more easily go into the next one. And so now I'm excited to read the next one. So, thank you to everybody who commented on that video because like it was really helpful. But that's all I have, you guys. So those are all my stats, the best, worst, disappointing, I don't even know how to talk about these books, and special mentions. So let me know down below all of your highlights for the year, best, worst. Did you guys have any books that you really didn't know how to talk about because like you had two completely different mindsets about it? Because I feel like kind of weird that I had so many books like that. Um, let me know all of it down below, but that is all I have. So if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and until next time, have happy reading, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.